Europa Universalis 5 is, without a doubt, one of Paradox Interactive's most ambitious projects in recent years, and its development context reveals a lot about the expectations and pressures surrounding this iconic franchise. Development officially began in 2020, when Paradox founded the Paradox Tinto studio in Barcelona, specifically to work on the Europa Universalis series. The studio was placed under the direction of Johan Andersson, co-founder of Paradox and original creator of the Europa Universalis franchise, someone who carries over 25 years of experience in the grand strategy genre. It is fascinating to see how the company decided to create an entirely new studio dedicated to this project, demonstrating how valuable the franchise is to Paradox's identity, and how seriously they took the challenge of creating a worthy sequel to Europa Universalis. 4. The development strategy was absolutely unusual by industry standards, and this deserves to be highlighted. Instead of announcing the game and then leaving the community in suspense until launch, Paradox Tinto adopted a transparent and collaborative approach that lasted for over a year. Starting in early 2024, the studio began to discreetly publish posts on the forums called Tinto Talks, which detailed specific aspects of the game such as the economy, diplomacy, the map, and the Holy Roman Empire mechanics. There were an impressive 62 development diaries released before the official announcement in May 2025, something that seems almost radical for an industry obsessed with secrecy and controlled hype. Johan Andersson admitted that he wanted to reveal even more earlier, but that marketing people tend to panic when you start talking. This frankness is refreshing and shows a genuine confidence in the project. What makes this approach even more interesting is how community feedback actively shaped the game's development. It wasn't just a public relations exercise. The team truly implemented significant changes based on player reactions. A concrete example was the relationship between POPs, population units, and estates, influence groups. Originally, there was a direct and limited connection between 4 estates and 5 population types, but after community feedback, the system was expanded to include multiple adaptive estates and more variety in population types, including laborers, soldiers, and tribals. This demonstrates a genuine willingness to iterate and improve, something that should be more common in the industry, but unfortunately is not. This type of participatory development creates a sense of co-creation that can be extremely powerful for engaging the fan base. The historical context within Paradox also weighs heavily on the development of Europa Universalis 5. The company has gone through disappointing releases recently, including Victoria 3, Cities Skylines 2, and especially the initial failure of Imperator Rome. These stumbles created a growing distrust among fans regarding Paradox's ability to deliver complete and polished strategy games at launch. Europa Universalis 4, on the other hand, remains a cash cow for the company, generating constant revenue through DLCs and maintaining an active player base more than a decade after its 2013 release. The success of EU5 is not just desirable, it is absolutely crucial to restore consumer confidence and ensure the future of the Tinto studio. There is immense pressure on Johan and his team to get it right this time. The historical context within Paradox also weighs heavily on the development of Europa Universalis 5. The company has gone through disappointing releases recently, including Victoria 3 Cities, Skylines 2, and especially the initial failure of Imperator Rome. These stumbles created a growing distrust among fans regarding Paradox's ability to deliver complete and polished strategy games at launch. Europa Universalis 4, on the other hand, remains a cash cow for the company, generating constant revenue through DLCs and maintaining an active player base more than a decade after its 2013 release. The success of EU5 is not just desirable, it is absolutely crucial to restore consumer confidence and ensure the future of the Tinto studio. There is immense pressure on Johan and his team to get it right this time. The development of Europa Universalis 5 represents an attempt to balance radical innovation with respect for the expectations of hardcore strategy fans. Johan Andersson and Paradox Tinto are essentially trying to satisfy one of the most demanding and knowledgeable communities in gaming, while simultaneously making the game accessible to new players and modernizing systems that are rooted in design concepts from over 2 decades ago. The fact that they chose radical transparency and community collaboration as their development strategy suggests an acute awareness that they cannot fail. The project carries the weight of decades of legacy, millions of hours played by devoted fans, and the hopes of restoring Paradox's reputation after recent problematic launches. It is a decisive moment, not only for the Tinto studio, but possibly for the future of Paradox as a leader in the grand strategy genre. The story of Europa Universalis 5 is one of the most ambitious ever created by Paradox Interactive, and personally, perhaps the one that has best managed to capture the feeling of truly watching human evolution unfold before your eyes. The game begins in 1337, during the prelude to the 100 Years' War, expanding the franchise's historical period by more than a century before the start of U4. This medieval beginning provides an atmosphere of uncertainty and fragility. Unstable kingdoms, the Black Death devastating populations, and the power of the church shaping every decision. Paradox tries, here, not only to give the player control of a country, but to make them feel the weight of each decision in the face of a world literally being rebuilt. What's fascinating is that this timeline extends to 1837, the year Queen Victoria ascends to the British throne, symbolizing the end of the medieval era and the dawn of the modern age. For nearly 500 years, the player follows the birth, growth, and decay of empires, with large and small historical events unfolding organically. From the Protestant Reformation to the Napoleonic Wars, the game recreates a world that seems to pulse with its own life. And unlike previous titles, Europa Universalis 5 allows some mechanics to be automated, which gives space to focus on what really matters, be it trade, exploration, or conquest. The great narrative hook lies in the new population system. It's no longer about controlling cold, abstract provinces. Now, the game gives faces, religion, culture, and social status to the inhabitants. This makes all the difference in immersion. When a revolt breaks out, it's not just because of numbers on a spreadsheet. It's because an oppressed ethnic or religious group decided they couldn't take it anymore. This layer of humanity gives an almost dramatic rhythm to the story, turning political decisions into moral dilemmas. It's as if the game stops being an interactive spreadsheet and becomes a continuous struggle between prosperity and survival. The narrative also gains strength from dynamic historical events, which shape themselves according to the path of the world the player builds. The 100 Years' War, the Renaissance, the French Revolution, everything can happen in completely different ways depending on the choices made. It's a powerful narrative illusion. Even though it's a totally strategic game, Europa Universalis 5 has moments of pure emergent narrative, where a diplomatic betrayal or an economic miracle changes the fate of entire nations. The fascinating side is the contrast between realism and chaos. In EU5, trying to maintain total control is a mistake. There are political fires, epidemics, and revolts on all sides, and often the player must choose the lesser evil. It's a game that celebrates failure as much as victory. Unlike more linear titles, it seems to reward the ability to adapt and not just win. Over the centuries, the map transforms in a living and unpredictable way, and it's easy to find yourself rooting for historical events to go wrong just to see what happens. The historical tone is reinforced by the visual and sound ambiance. The global map has been rebuilt with a more accurate cartographic projection, and the soundtrack provides the political and emotional weight that previous titles lacked. It really seems like Paradox wanted to turn human history into an interactive epic. Seeing the birth of modern states, the collapse of secular dynasties, and the flourishing of global trade gives the feeling of writing a living encyclopedia, where every move matters. The history of Europa Universalis 5 is not a traditional narrative line. It is a systemic organism that breathes and changes according to your actions. And that is what makes it, in my opinion, so brilliant. It allows the player to recreate the steps of civilization with total freedom and still feel the historical weight of the consequences. It's a game where the plot is not in texts or cutscenes, but in the decisions that define centuries. To play U5 is to live history, to err with it, to win with it, and most beautifully, to never see two worlds alike. The gameplay of Europa Universalis 5 is an even deeper and more absorbing dive into the grand-scale strategy genre, elevating practically all the systems of its predecessor to a new level of complexity. The first sensation is one of vastness. The map is now gigantic, with tens of thousands of locations instead of the old provinces, resulting in a much more granular representation of the world. Each of these locations carries a living population, with pops reminiscent of Victoria 3, and this completely changes the game's economic and social dynamics. The way these groups consume goods and produce goods makes the economy more organic and unpredictable. It's the kind of system that demands obsessive planning but rewards absurdly when you trade. Routes and internal policies work in harmony. One of the most captivating aspects is the feeling of literally managing a world in motion. The simulation of population, transportation, faith, and cultures intertwines with major historical events. The game covers from the late medieval era to the 19th century, and everything changes over time. A plan that works in 1450 might be a disaster in 1650, and this historical transformation brings the map to life. It's more than controlling a country. It's managing an entire society in transition. I particularly liked how the game makes you feel the weight of time, with eras that bring new tech trees and strategic decisions that permanently shape the future. On the military side, Europa Universalis V maintains the solid foundation of the fourth game, but refines the battle simulations with more realism and interdependence between weapons. Wars now unfold with tactical slowness and more logistical focus. Your troops need supplies, transport, and morale to maintain a stable campaign. Cavalry, artillery, and infantry function as complementary elements with situational advantages, and the battles reflect well the chaos and attrition of prolonged wars. It's the kind of system that requires patience, and it's easy to get lost trying to coordinate multiple fronts. But at the same time, it delivers enormous satisfaction when you plan a months-long siege and see the enemy fall from exhaustion. The new diplomatic system is another highlight, and probably what surprised me the most. Relations between nations now feel alive, mediated not only by treaties and marriages, but also by dynamic international organizations like the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, which are now active and adaptive political entities. This adds enormous layers of strategy. A decision that pleases Rome might enrage a coalition of reformists 2 borders away. Playing as an Italian or episcopal power, for example, forces you to think as much about faith as about gold. And it's the kind of dilemma that makes each campaign unique. The trade system is perhaps the most ambitious in the franchise to date. Everything produced in the world is consumed by someone, and this constant cycle of supply and demand defines the prosperity or ruin of entire empires. Playing as a merchant nation like Venice or Portugal is almost another game, a kind of economic simulator within the grand geopolitical board. Trade routes now demand complex infrastructures, with roads and ports directly affecting the efficiency of flows. Nothing is fixed. An efficient naval blockade can break an entire trading empire in a matter of months. In terms of pacing, Europa Universalis V remains demanding, perhaps even more than it should be. As a player, it's easy to feel overwhelmed with so much information, especially in the early eras. Task automation helps, but there's a constant temptation to want to control everything manually, and the game rewards precisely this type of obsession. It's addictive to watch your civilization grow and see every small decision echo centuries later. Despite the brutal learning curve, the design is so detailed and organic that every mistake feels like a natural part of the journey. Overall, the gameplay of Europa Universalis V is a balance between grandeur and madness. It's the kind of game that makes you lose hours without realizing it, not by offering constant action, but by involving you in a web of systems that simulate the chaos of human history. Personally, I see it more as an interactive work of art than a simple strategy game. It's dense, sometimes frustrating, but completely hypnotic. Every fallen empire, every sealed agreement, every unexpected revolt seems to emerge from a living and uncontrollable logic. Europa Universalis V is not just about commanding the world. It's about understanding the world, and in it, understanding the weight of your own choices. The graphics represent a notable visual leap by the standards of Paradox interactive games, although they maintain that aesthetic that is more functional than cinematic. The new engine, an evolution of the one used in Imperator, Rome, brought more detailed models for the terrain, more beautiful atmospheric effects, and a greater sense of depth to the landscapes. Mountains, for example, are no longer simple painted reliefs, but now have shadows and textures that change with the daylight, creating an almost historical diorama look. This type of treatment doesn't place the game among the most visually impressive on the market, but within the strategy genre, it has a very distinct technical and artistic charm. One of the first things you notice is the new map layer system. There are now over 7D visualization modes, each with slight variations in color, texture, and relief that allow you to see complex information without losing the game world's identity. It's a dense and immersive visual experience. Each region, from the Sahara to the Caucasus, has its geography depicted with evident care. Tundras are covered in soft fog, deserts shimmer under an almost blinding sun. It's the kind of subtlety that turns long gaming sessions into something pleasing to the eyes, even without striving for photorealism. The use of color is perhaps the biggest differentiator. Europa Universalis 5 has definitively abandoned the pastel and somewhat washed-out tone of the fourth game, opting for a more expressive contrast, especially in the political and geographical modes. In practice, the territories look hand-painted, and this helps the player feel like they are navigating an old atlas map. Visually, there is something almost artisanal about the design. The borders glow subtly, the seas reflect light with a discreet ripple. It may seem like a detail, but this combination gives a living world feeling, which pairs perfectly with the game's concept of simulating dynamic populations and civilizations. However, not all fans received these graphics with open arms. Many more traditional players found the new style too clean and even plastic, especially when compared to the rougher, more analog charm of Europa Universalis 4. Some say that the look of V seems more modern, but less atmospheric, almost as if it had lost a bit of that rustic medieval map identity. I personally understand this criticism. Sometimes visual clarity comes at the cost of aesthetic soul, and EU5 indeed seems to want to show too much, perhaps moving away from the more serious historical character the series has always had. But looking beyond nostalgia, it's undeniable that the game has evolved. The lighting treatment in particular is beautiful. The game gains a real territorial personality when the sun sets over the Mediterranean or when storms cover northern Europe. There are smooth transitions of weather, seasons, and even small particles like snow and dust. None of this is purely aesthetic, as it subtly interferes with visibility and even the performance of troops in certain regions. This creates a visual connection with the mechanics rarely seen in this type of game. Perhaps the most interesting thing is how the graphics handle the human scale of the world. Each province now contains visible populations that are reflected in the small groupings of houses, ports, or fortresses. It's not a total war, of course, but there is something fascinating in seeing a city gradually expand, with new settlements appearing visually as the population development increases. It's an elegant type of visual feedback, more suggestive than explicit, that rewards those who pay attention to the map's transformation over the centuries. Overall, Europa Universalis 5 may not be the most beautiful game in the world, but it is the most artistically cohesive within the grand strategy genre. It doesn't try to compete with modern graphics engines from action games, but rather to create a world map that invites you to contemplate history unfolding before your eyes. The new visual style, even with controversies, brings a freshness to the series without completely losing its DNA. It's a delicate balance, technical enough to impress but stylized enough to remain a map game, not a visual spectacle. And frankly, for someone who spends hours managing empires, this is the kind of beauty that lasts the longest. Europa Universalis 5 is one of those games that demand more than just a powerful PC. It demands patience and attention to detail. Right off the bat, the performance surprised me for two opposing reasons. The new engine brought a noticeable fluidity compared to IV, especially in zooms and map movement, but there are still moments when performance plummets when the world reaches that critical point of historical complexity. The late games, around 1700 onwards, continue to be the real test of hardware and patience. Even with an SSD and a top-tier processor, the time between calendar days starts to lag. And this is a bit frustrating when you're in the middle of a world war and want to see things happen quickly. What impressed me positively was the use of the Paradox Arc engine, a strong evolution of Clausewitz, which handles rendering and the use of multiple CPU cores better. For the first time, it feels like the game is actually trying to leverage modern processors, and you can feel this when switching between global zoom scale and regional level. There are fewer stutters when trade and diplomacy maps are opened simultaneously, which was a torment in 4. The frame rate in 4K remains stable most of the time, but don't expect constant smoothness if you're managing empires with hundreds of provinces. Visually, even for a strategy game, Europa Universalis 5 is light on modern GPUs. The bottleneck remains the CPU and RAM, as the game processes an absurd amount of simultaneous simulations: diplomacy, AI, trade routes, revolts, missions, and events. On machines with at least 32 GB of RAM, the game runs as if it was designed for that kind of setup. But on average PCs, there are moments of constant stutter, especially when multiple empires collide in large-scale wars. I noticed that the new shader layer on the maps, especially the sunlight and dynamic clouds effect, can also impact performance more than you would expect from a strategy game. From the mid-16th century onwards, the game clearly starts to show the limits of optimization. Even with recent updates, the AI consumes more resources than necessary, and the event checks start to weigh heavily. The feeling is that the world is more alive and with diplomatic decisions being made in real time. but you feel the price of this when the game starts processing each month at a snail's pace. It's inevitable to be tempted to reduce the time speed, not just for strategy, but because the fluidity simply can't keep up. What's curious is that in multiplayer mode, the network performance seems surprisingly solid, as long as all players have decent machines. Paradox has significantly improved turn synchronization and the initial load of the shared map. But still, it only takes one player with a weak PC to lag the entire session. It's a collective experience of stuttering when that happens, and it seems the game still needs adjustments in this area. Even so, there are fewer problems with ghost disconnections and much less desynchronization in the passage of time compared to 4, which is a real technical advancement. During long campaigns, RAM and cache consumption increases noticeably. After 6 or 7 consecutive hours, the game starts to store a growing volume of temporary data, and the overall performance drops even on powerful machines. I even restarted the application just to regain fluidity in crucial stretches. This reminded me that, no matter how modern this engine is, Europa Universalis is still a colossally heavy game in simulation, perhaps impossible to keep fully stable in the long run. At least the loading screens have been reduced and the autosave is fast, which helps to compensate for this gradual slowdown. The performance of Europa Universalis 5 is a mix of technical progress and inevitable limitations. It runs better than any previous Paradox title that tries to simulate the entire world, but it still suffers from the same ailment of cumulative complexity. It's the typical case of a game where performance is good enough at the beginning and naturally deteriorates as the world becomes denser. Still, for those who love the genre, these stutters are almost part of the charm. The slowdown in 1700 is like a reminder that the planet you built has become too large even for the game itself. Being such a dense title, the launch is not for everyone. The game is known for being highly challenging in terms of learning and can seem intimidating, especially for those who haven't played the previous ones in depth. The gameplay at the beginning can feel like swimming in a storm, with many new and specific mechanics to master. And this can still be accompanied by technical problems typical of such an ambitious launch, such as optimization that is still being improved. If you are a hardcore grand strategy fan, someone who appreciates not only historical simulation, but also enjoys delving into political and logistical nuances, and doesn't mind spending hours understanding every aspect, Europa Universalis 5 is well worth it at launch. For this audience, the game delivers a new experience that differs significantly from EU4, with a new approach and unprecedented richness. However, if you are a more casual player or new to the series, it might be more worthwhile to wait for patches and updates that make the game more accessible and stable over time. Another important consideration for launch is the investment of time and money. EU5 tends to have additions with extra content, regional DLCs, classic EU4 soundtrack that justify the premium price, but the base title already offers a very complex experience. If you can afford the investment and want the complete experience right away, buying at launch makes sense. Otherwise, the common recommendation from the community is to wait for the first few months to enjoy a more polished game with more robust content, as was the trajectory of the previous title. Europa Universalis 5 is suitable for those who like deep strategy, detailed management, and have a love for history, especially for experienced players of the series who want a giant leap in complexity and simulation. It is not a casual title and will not receive simplifications to attract new audiences in its first version, which may turn off those looking for something lighter or less intricate. My personal opinion is that it is a game that deserves attention for its scope and innovation. And if you like this total immersion in grand strategy and history, buying at launch can be an incredible experience, despite the normal stumbles of a complex release. If you are not in a hurry and prefer a smoother and more complete experience, waiting a few months might provide a more polished game. Whatever your decision, EU5 promises to be a watershed moment for the genre and for dedicated fans of the franchise. Therefore, for those who truly live and breathe grand strategy, who already have experience with the series and want to be surprised, buying at launch is valid. As for beginner players or those who don't want to get frustrated with steep learning curves, it's best to wait for the first patches and improvements, while also taking advantage of the still relevant Europa Universalis 4.